Good morning. For me, Bernie Taupin's words are heartbreaking. What went wrong? Whose fault was it? What do we know? I think we know this relationship is over. What do I do when lightning strikes me and I wake to find that you're not there? Would sorry have helped? Would it have mended whatever went wrong? Would it have made the parting easier? Hard to know. But as he said, sorry is hard. There's another love song. Elton John and Bernie Taupin wrote that in 2002. 30 years before that, there was another love song about apologies. And I'd like to play just a wee bit of that for you this morning. Some of you will recognize it. You've probably heard it before. It was inspired by the movie Love Story.
Love means you never have to say you're sorry.
I was a teenager when that came out. And even then, I thought that was the stupidest thing I'd ever heard. Love means you don't have to say you're sorry? Let's take an example. Years ago, I was the president of the Ventura County Writers Club, a club, by the way, that began in Ojai in 1933. They are celebrating their 90th anniversary this year. The pandemic came, the club shut down, and when it was time to start back up, it seemed like that was not working. There was rent and not very many people were interested, and the current president called me and said, can you meet with me? If we don't save the club, it's going under after 90 years. And we met. She's a lovely woman, about my age. We've known each other literally for decades. The years have been kind. She is a beautiful woman inside and out. And we sat at Tifa, my favorite coffee shop, and had chocolate and coffee and talked about how we might save the club. Well, we said goodbye. I came home. I walked in the door, and Marin said, "Where have you been? I was so worried you were gone for 4 hours." I had no idea. But imagine if I said, "Oh, honey, I should have called, but you know what? I love you. And that means I don't have to say I'm sorry." I don't think that would go over so well. Now let's suppose the writers of that song we just heard the snippet of were grammatically challenged. Let's suppose that they didn't mean love means you never have to say you're sorry. They meant something closer to what Paul was writing to the Corinthians. Love, when you love someone in that way, everything else just slides right off. And therefore, someone doesn't need to apologize to you if you love them the way Paul talks about. And for me, that kind of love reminds me of the love a parent feels for a child. I don't remember how old our daughter was when it seeped into my bones that I loved her in a way that was different, that surpassed anything else, that I would do anything in my power for her, you get the idea. All of you who are parents, you understand what I'm talking about. She grew up from a little girl into a teenager. There were some disagreements. We talked with other parents, and especially other parents who were older than we were and had been through this before, and we heard the same story several times, and it went something like this. I was your daughter when I was her age. My mother couldn't do anything right, and she was strangling me, and she didn't like the college, and she didn't like the boy, blah, blah, blah. I fell in love, I got married, I had kids, and I went back to her and said, "Mom, I understand now. I'm sorry." If we believe Paul and what he says, that sorry isn't necessary. Maybe the grammatically challenged writers of the song had an idea. It's not necessary, but a sorry like that would solve 1,000 wounds. So, what is a good apology? I'd like to talk for a minute about what I think is not a good apology, what I think is a failure of an apology, and that is any apology that begins with the word if. If I said something that offended you, I'm sorry. What is that if doing? Maybe I did, maybe I didn't. Maybe you heard something, maybe you didn't. But if you did, that is not, in my book, an apology. That is a work around an apology. That's a cowardly way of sneaking out of an apology. My second least favorite kind of apology is a kind that includes a clause, a get-out-of-jail-free clause. I'm sorry, but. I'm sorry I yelled at you, honey, but you made me mad. I'm sorry, but. I'm sorry I ran over the dog, but it was dark and I didn't see it. I'm sorry, but I was tired. I'm sorry, but I was drunk. I'm sorry, but. The but is the apologizer excusing his own or her own apology. I'm sorry, but. It's not really, it was mitigating circumstances. That's not an apology either, in my book. Let's take another example. Let's go back a generation to cocktail parties. Let's say the men have all wandered out onto the patio, drinks in hand. The women have all collected in the kitchen, talking about their kids, maybe talking about their husbands. And the hostess is keeping an ear out because out on the patio, the laughter is getting louder, longer, more raucous, and she's thinking, all those husbands have to drive all my friends home. We're switching to coffee. And she puts together a tray with the cups and the saucers and the cream and the sugar and the pot, and she walks out there and she slides that door open with her hip and gracefully turns around just as her husband, who is standing with his back to her, says, "You think you've got it bad? My mother-in-law is a scorpion." The smiles freeze on every guy's face. She puts the tray down. He turns around and sees her, and she says, "Gentlemen, drink your coffee because the bar is closed." And she walks back inside. All the husbands make an excuse. They find their wives. They gulp their coffee. They're going. And the temperature in that house is dropping to somewhere near 0. Now, let's try those apologies. Honey, if I said something about your mother, I'm sorry. Honey, I said something mean about your mom, but you know how she can be. Are those going to, this man, if lightning strikes this man, is he going to wake and find her there? Here for me is a sincere apology. It is simple. It doesn't need to explain. It doesn't need to explain much. In that situation, that husband might try, "Honey, I said something mean about your mom, and it hurt you. And for that, I'm sorry." That's an apology. Now, what's an appropriate response to a sincere apology? In Christian circles, it might be, "I forgive you." Here's something interesting. In Buddhist circles, that would not be the appropriate thing to say. In Buddhism, the concept, it's a long thing that we won't get into right now, but it's called causes and conditions. Under the right causes and conditions, any of us could say what that person just said. Any of us could do what that person just did. I am no better than you. In Buddhism, apology kind of makes a tier thing. If you imagine that husband, "Honey, I'm sorry. Okay, I forgive you." Or, "I will never forgive you for that." Or, "Give me some time to work on maybe forgiving you." There is a power dynamic here. And Buddhism is like Protestants. There are 18,000 different kinds. But for most Buddhists, understanding would take the place of forgiveness. It's been said, there's a quote that I'm going to butcher, but if to truly understand someone is to mean there is no need for an apology. Because you understand what they were feeling, what they were doing, why they, it's not necessarily easy, but that's the concept. There's a story about Buddha and apologies, and I have this vague recollection that Eric may have told this story, so some of you may have heard it. But the story goes like this, in essence. Buddha, by the way, there are books written, one of them by Thich Nhat Hanh, Living Buddha, Living Christ, comparing the messages of love that Buddha preached and the messages of love that Christ preached, and how close they are in many ways to each other. One of the major differences that I've always been aware of is that Christ preached for 3 years. Buddha preached for 50. He crossed the country. He had his followers, just like disciples. They went from city to city, from town to town, from farm to farm. It is said that Buddha could look at his audience and gauge them. They were city folk. They were town folk. They were fishermen. They were farmers. They were hunters. And he could make Dharma talk that they would relate to, that they would understand. It said he gave in those 50 years, he gave more than 18,000. So, in this story, Buddha and his disciples are walking along toward a village, and they are crossing this huge farm from this very rich man. And the farmer workers recognize Buddha, and they drop their shovels and their picks, and they say, "It's the Buddha, it's the Buddha." And they come to him, and they say, "Buddha, if you could just stop with us for a minute." And Buddha says, "Sure." And he stops, and he waits for them together, and the farmer, sitting in his house, looking out his window, sees this and becomes enraged. And he storms out of the house and walks up to Buddha and says, "How dare you? These are my workers. They're not working right now. They're sitting and listening to you. This is an outrage. I demand that you leave my property immediately." And his wife, who's right behind him, going, honey, it's the Buddha." So he goes back in, harumphing and smoking his pipe and reading his paper and crossing his arms. And Buddha says, "I'm on my way to another talk. This is going to be very short. I will see you again on my way back." And the husband is inside paying no attention. And the wife says, "Honey, you should come see this." Buddha is leaving. He's going on his way. And all the farmer workers are going back, picking up the hose. They are smiling. They are laughing. They are talking to each other. They are working harder than they've ever worked before. Next day, Buddha comes back. They come and gather again, and he talks for just a few minutes, and all the workers are leaving and smiling, and the farmer walks up to him and says, "I was so mean to you yesterday. Can you please forgive me?" And Buddha says, "There is no need for forgiveness." And the farmer says, "But I said all those mean things about your mother." Yeah. And Buddha says, "The angry man who was here yesterday is not the man standing before me today. The man standing before me today has no need of forgiveness." Causes and conditions. So, if I forgive you is maybe not the best answer to a sincere apology, what might work? The one that works for me is, "Honey, I said that mean thing about your mom, and it hurt you, and I'm sorry." An answer might be, "Thank you for saying that." When you know you've hurt someone, offer them an apology. Simple, sincere, no ifs, no ands, no buts. A simple, sincere apology. And you may live without the regret that Bernie showed about sorry being the hardest word. Namu Amina Butsu.